What's up, everyone, and welcome to Making the Shift for Autistic Kids.
We're an SLP couple from California with 4 boys.
And we're here every week to bring you neuro-affirming tips, tricks, and tools.
Are you ready to make the shift?
Let's do this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Making the Shift. Today, I am in my clinic. Chris is dancing because he's so excited to be back at school. So today we are talking about something that everyone wants to hear about and no one wants to talk about.
That's right. So we're going to touch on some difficult topics and concepts in an easy to understand way. This episode is a no shame, no blame zone, more for educational purposes to help guide ideas, shift thoughts, and help with those that you work with.
Wow, that was beautiful. It's like you would have thought you had that written down, but I know you, so I know that you don't.
I tattooed it on my brain.
So today we're talking about behavioral therapy, specifically ABA for autistic kids. We're going to be sharing, what our personal experiences, what our personal perspectives are. So keep that in mind that the thoughts we're sharing are our own. Also, Chris and I do have different perspectives on this because we've had different lives, different work experiences, different settings. So I'm excited to have this conversation as well, just to see kind of what those differences are and things we agree on too. But, this is something that we joke that no one wants to talk about because it's so controversial. And sometimes it's like, you feel like no matter what you say, it's going to be wrong. And I think that's why people are so afraid of this topic, because it's regardless of what you say, not every person is going to agree with you. That's how life is. But what we really wanted to do again was share what our personal experiences were. And first of all, I will say that I was trained as a behavioral therapist when I was in grad school. And so many people are shocked to hear that because it's so different than what I do now. But I was looking for a job and those jobs were like all over the place. And I ended up getting hired as a one-on-one aide for a 7-year-old girl in a private school. And I had no prior experience with any type of behavioral therapy, just so that you know where I was coming from. I actually had a floor time background. So this was very different. And I think I can speak for a lot of us when I say, one experience is not like every other experience, right? You could have completely different experiences with therapists and with therapy. And I think that's really important for us to say and acknowledge. So this is just what my experience was, which was basically I was taught, maybe I had 2 days of training with this little girl's BCBA who was previously her one-on-one. And this is what it looked like. And if you've been in this situation before, this probably sounds familiar. But basically, first day, her BCBA hands me this fat binder of concepts that they'd been working on. Like, these are things she'd been working on for years. And she basically taught me how to kind of go through what I would do with this little girl every day. And I actually wrote about this in my book. So if you've read it, you've read the story. But she would say, you want to ask this little girl every question 3 times. If she gets it wrong 3 times in a row, you're going to mark it as an X, and then you're going to move on to the next thing. So I just cannot take this one moment out of my memory, which is I always had to ask her, what's the weather like today? And we wanted her to say like sunny, rainy, whatever. So I would say, what's the weather today? No response. So I would ask the second time, what's the weather today? No response. Third time, what's the weather today? And looking back, she was definitely a Gestalt language processor. And she went, rainbow. And I'm like, okay, mark that as wrong, which is funny because it is kind of related to the weather looking back. But it was like a very structured way I was taught to do something. I was literally just like following what I was taught by the book. But also part of that job was me sitting next to her in class, which was her least favorite place to be, and trying to keep her behaviors to a minimum, because we would sit in the class and she had these like erasers she loved. They were her favorite thing. And I would have a token board out that I was having her work for, you know, Velcro stars. And like we would be working, and then all of a sudden she would take all of her papers. This was second grade, and she would just throw them up in the air and they would go everywhere. And she would just scream as loud as she possibly could. She would tip her chair back to the point of falling over. And I mean, the whole time I'm just prompting her, like, quiet hands, quiet mouth, you know, which was what I was taught to do with her. So I think that this was a really hard job for me, because to me it just didn't feel good on the inside. Like I think the easiest thing you can do to know if a therapy is right for you as a therapist or you as a parent or the child is to think about, does this feel good? Because I genuinely believe therapy should feel good. And it was in the moments when I wasn't in class with her when I saw the most connection and engagement with her. Like I would sit her on my lap and we would sing songs back and forth, and I would teach her the words to different songs, and we'd spin around and we'd swing and we'd do sensory activities. And it was like, that was the time she was connected and engaged in learning, not when I was like just trying to keep all of her behaviors to a minimum. So I think that, you know, this really leads into, why is it a problem when that our approach is to keep behaviors to a minimum? And maybe this is a good time to kind of like talk about, what is ABA really?
Yeah, I could dive into that. I wanted to shout out what you mentioned though, because as a parent, Jesse and I, we have our 3-year-old who has some pretty big feelings and emotions, especially lately. And I think about like punishments and rewards. Does that work for this child, or are there alternative ways that could benefit him more in the long run, such as working towards regulating his emotions, asking for help when he needs it, and all sorts of things, right? And, you know, every once in a while, just in my nature, I will, you know, sometimes go the punishment route and notice that over time, that's just not working, right? And so as a parent, I reflect back and go, yeah, this just doesn't, this doesn't seem to be working, or sometimes things might even be seeming to get worse. So I think working with a child in a certain type of approach for a therapeutic setting, does it seem like this is leading to more behaviors elsewhere, more challenges? Does it seem to be that the child's becoming even more dysregulated? Like all of those things, I think, are in our own instincts, like our own survival instincts as parents, right? We could feel it. We're like, okay, this is working or this isn't working. So I wanted to just chime
Definitely
in
know
with
when
that.
it's not working.
Right. Like I could feel it. You know, I feel like that too in my setting here on the schools and talking to parents and families in IEP meetings, and sometimes, you know, the even getting to school and then their own feelings. It's like, yeah, that those feelings are happening because your instincts, they know that, you know, things could be challenging for your child. And that's kind of our job as parents, is to protect our children, to help guide them, to give them the tools to, you know, help with all of the things that Jesse and I teach, you know, regulation, emotional regulation, advocacy, and those types of things. So, yeah, so let's just talk about just like some just simple basic ideas. Again, this is a shorter episode that the topic could be, honestly, we could speak for 48 hours straight. ABA, what does it stand for? Applied Behavioral Analysis, right? So it is a science. The idea behind it is to understand and predict and shape behavior. That's kind of the easiest way of looking at it. So shaping behavior, changing one's behavior is kind of the umbrella idea of that type of intervention. It uses operant conditioning, meaning shaping behavior, and it uses positive reinforcement. So you'll hear that used a lot in most settings. When you talk about ABA, you will hear positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means rewards, whether it's verbal praise, a lot of good job, good job, good job. Child works great with heavy use of verbal praise, or use of a token system, sticker charts, and those types of things. So that's kind of the idea behind it. A lot of the goals can be a little challenging because the goals they tend to be behavioral based, and they don't tend, I remember, I don't want, no shame, no blame, but they don't tend to consider autistic needs. Jesse's very well versed in sensory needs and the sensory system. And I'm well versed in the nervous system as well as the sensory system, both of us on the nervous system, sensory. And the behaviors and the approaches and the goals tend to dismiss that. And so that's where it can become challenging, because with an ABA type approach, they're looking at observable behaviors. I'm going to have Jesse talk a little bit more about this, but it's looking at observable behaviors. Why? Because those are measurable. The things that are not measurable are things that you don't observe, such as Jesse
So
died.
like we like to use the iceberg analogy. We've talked about this in past shows before, where if you think of a behavior as an iceberg, what you see is the tip of the iceberg. That's what's observable. And when I was working with this little girl, and she tried to run out of the classroom, that's the behavior I'm observing. So typically, in behavioral therapy, you ask the question, how can I get this kid to sit still, right? You might ask something like that. How can I get her to stop throwing her papers? How can I get her to stop screaming? And that kind of leads us to an approach of using prompts like quiet hands, quiet mouth, right? Because that's the answer to that question. The problem is that that's not the right question to be asking. The question we should be asking is, why is she trying to run out of the classroom? Why is it so hard for her to sit through these lessons in the classroom? And that's where the answer is not going to be at the tip of the iceberg. The answer is going to be underneath the water where we can't see it. And that's hard because it's internal. And like Chris said, so much of ABA is driven on, data and numbers and measuring and percentages. And it's hard to know if a kid is 100% regulated or not. And it's a lot easier to, write goals based on the observable behaviors that we see. So, I think that when I've worked with therapists in the past and aides who have been really great with kids, those are the people who are looking beyond the tip of the iceberg. Those are the people who are thinking about, like, is this child's sensory needs being met? Does this child feel emotionally regulated? Does this child feel safe in this environment? Did this child get sleep last night? Is this child pain-free in their body, right? And they're looking at all of the things under the surface. And I think ultimately, if we really want to help our kids the most, our focus really needs to be more at the underlying, the water level, as opposed to the surface level.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the other thing too, is that typically through the program, through what ABA practitioners are learning, they're not learning about autistic sensory needs, autistic social and emotional needs, and those types of things. So what ends up happening is that goals can tend to be created. Again, I don't like to say an always or never thing, but goals can and approaches can sometimes tend to dismiss all of those to shape or change into extinguishing those differences. And so what
And
ends up
to be fair, a lot of other professionals do
right.
that as well, right? So like that's an argument we hear a lot, is like, well, there's great professionals in every field and ones that aren't so great. And I totally agree with that, it's just more of like the nature, oftentimes, like Chris is saying, of the goal is inherently dismissing the underlying need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that I reflect back on the other concept too, when a parent gets that initial diagnosis from the diagnostician, the healthcare provider, the pediatrician of autism. A lot of times things are changing, but a lot of times the doctor will say the this is the recommendation, and it'll be for ABA, right? And the idea for that recommendation is that autism is a behavioral diagnosis, and that's not the case. Autism, we have to remind ourselves, is not a behavioral diagnosis. Autism is a dynamic disability. It is a neurological and developmental disability, not a behavioral. And so that changes everything when we look at it. So when I talk to people at work and neighbors and friends, or people that reach out on social media that say, hey, look, I heard you're talking about certain approaches and things, but like, what should I do instead of that approach, ABA therapy? That, I think, again, like what Jesse said, is we shift our thoughts on the question. The question shouldn't be, what do I do instead? The question should be, what are your concerns of what challenges the student or the child is experiencing? If the child's experiencing some difficulties communicating, then your go-to person is going to be an SLP, a speech pathologist, right? A neuro-affirming SLP. If the challenges are involved with sensory sensitivities and a lot of dysregulation, then you can collaborate with someone that's trained in sensory. Jessie and her team, you could talk to an occupational therapist, those that are involved with sensory integration. If the child has difficulties with anxiety, or you're seeing more of those kind of concerns, then you would reach out to a mental health provider that's neuroaffirming. PDA, you would reach out to a parent coach. Like, how could I do this and manage this as a parent? And like, how can I structure the environment? If it's motor difficulties, apraxia, body movements, physical therapy. So the question is, what,
Or OT.
or OT? Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for chiming in there. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that really helps guide that discussion, the thoughts, because a lot of times, if an approach, and again, this isn't just solely about ABA, but like it could be speech OT, if the approach is to change or shape a behavior that's unnatural to the person, then over time, we have to think about the cost. Sure, maybe up front on the surface for the first couple months, we got the child to do the thing. We got them to stop crying. We got them to stop running. We got them to stop whatever it was. But the long-term damage, when it's unnatural to the person and unnatural to their neurology, leads to trauma. It leads to adult mental health challenges, because they've been told, hey, your neurology, we're going to try to change. We're going to try to rewire everything to make you typical, neurotypical, right? And so I just think that some of these thoughts are things to think about and to help guide that discussion and to help guide the decisions.
Yeah, and I think the big question people ask is like, but what can we do? Like, what are the solutions? How can we work collaboratively? Where do we go from here? You know, because when people are sitting at opposite ends of the spectrum, it's very hard to move forward. And I think, just from my experience being in our clinic, working with lots and lots and lots of kids who are in ABA and ABA therapists coming in and out over the years, I think the most important thing I've learned is that everyone needs to be on the same page, right? So like, it's really hard. And I talked about this recently on my social media, that there was a period of time where we didn't even have families come see us for therapy if they were in ABA, because it was just too different from what we were doing. And it was like, we were both going in opposite directions. And if my goal is to be child-led and have a kid come in here and play, and then they come in and they see my table and they all of a sudden think they have to work to get the things that they want, and then they get really stressed out when they come in, like, it was really inhibiting the progress we would see. But then again, and I talked about this too, which I kind of want to bring up again because it sparks some really good conversation, which is when I heard an autistic colleague say not doing ABA is a privilege, that is really when when I think I shifted perspective, because I realized like how true that was on so many levels, and just not something I'd really thought about, you know? And I know, like, we can't speak to the policies and funding all over the world. Obviously, that's not something that we know, but at least where we are, it's a lot easier and less money to get ABA than to get any other kind of therapy. It's a lot more convenient to get ABA than any other therapy. So when you have families who are working full time and can't be spending their life chauffeuring around their kids and paying privately for therapy, there are limited options, and there are limited options when it comes to choosing aides for your school. And the school doesn't just let you bring in whoever you want. And Chris obviously knows more about that than I do. But there are a lot of barriers that we have in place. And, you know, what we ended up doing, and this might be a good solution for some of you to start to think about, is we would have kids come in, we would work with their ABA, and we would review all of their goals. And we just made sure that either they weren't writing speech goals, communication goals, which is really, really hard because there are lots and lots of ABA companies who write a lot of language-based communication-based goals, or we were changing their goals for them. So, for example, we might have a kid who is like an early Gestalt language processor, and it would not be appropriate for him to be working on like a bunch of WH questions. And if they had a goal written for WH questions, we would change that goal, we would teach them, we would explain to them what stage of Gestalt language they were in and how they could be modeling to support that child, right? So it's like, if we can get them, if we were able to get them doing the goals that were appropriate for the child and on the same page as us, we've had some really successful collaborations. But I think like ultimately it comes down to how can we all in every field be more neurodiversity affirming? And I think the one thing that makes the biggest difference that just like no one talks about is just the way that we write our goals. I mean, I know we talk about that for speech, but like, to me, one of the biggest problems that we're seeing is how the goals are being written, because the way that the goal is written, like we were talking about before, it's about observable, measurable behavior, and it dictates what an entire day is going to be like for a child, right? Because if the goal is true story, child will not resist more than 2 times in a day, okay, true goal for a 6-year-old I had, then our whole day is going to be designed to keep this child from resisting anything. Or like if the goal is that the child has to follow 2-step directions, all of a sudden we need to have an entire session or an entire activity dedicated to just structured following directions activities, you know? So I feel like goals and data is a huge issue. I mean, obviously the more obvious issue is the funding and how do we get other therapies better funding, and I don't have the answer to that, and hopefully that is something we are, you know, working toward. But I think like in the short term, having more ND affirming training for every professional who's supporting autistic kids, along with, you know, better goals would help. What do
Yeah,
you
no,
think, Chris?
absolutely. And I liked how you mentioned too, like you look at them, you look at the goals, and then you can work on guiding, you know, and helping whoever's working with the child, like, hey, I think this might be a better approach to helping these needs. And I wanted to shout out that concept that you said, because here in California, and I know this isn't true for other states, but there are for some outside providers do come in as like a one-to-one aid with the students in the schools, those students that have more extensive support needs. And in my experience, coming at a level of connection and understanding and helping guide them, like, hey, you know, I've noticed that we're using a, you know, food reinforcement system to get this child to do the thing. And I'm wondering if we can provide maybe some additional supports with, maybe we could consider removing that and providing more outlets for them, having alternative ways to communicate and some sensory breaks, and maybe not having the reward system so much. And the people that I've worked with, especially here on my campus, have been very, very receptive to that and very open to the change, which is really a cool thing. So yeah, I didn't want to make my comments from earlier seem like I'm shutting anybody out. I've seen this and experienced some positive changes for a whole team of people. And that's
Yeah,
really
and
cool.
I also want to say, like, this is not the fault of the therapist. Like, this is such a field issue because, and I could say as someone who was trained to be a behavior therapist in 2 days, that like sometimes there is very little training. Therapists are just doing what they're taught. When I was a therapist, I was just doing what I was taught. I was just doing what I was supposed to be doing. And if more of these trainings and practices were built in, a lot of times these therapists are coming like out of high school or just out of college and very little work experience. They're being underpaid. They're working with kids all day long, who maybe have been in therapy for a long time, and it's challenging for them. And this huge company is profiting massively because the funding is so great. And then the therapists in the meantime are getting very little training and supervision and just doing what they're told to do. So I think that like there's a lot of systemic issues there, of course, but just at the like most basic level, if we could be implementing more training on it's like as simple as this iceberg analogy, because to me that iceberg analogy is just a game changer, because you look at your kids completely differently, you start asking different questions, and you start supporting them in different ways. So I think like we teach everyone that iceberg analogy, how to really think about behaviors, and then back to what you talked about, like supporting their emotional regulation, sensory needs, validating them, co-regulating. Those things just make such a difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's huge because yeah, the unobservable behaviors, feelings and emotions and anxiety are really hard to measure, but you can measure and help out one recognizing how their body's feeling and really working and collaborating and coming up with proactive solutions like the Dr. Ross Green stuff does with solutions to help one's nervous system and sensory system. I think that's key.
Yeah. So as we wrap this up, I wanted to share an exciting announcement with you guys, which is, and if you're sitting here and you're thinking, I really want to learn more about neurodiversity affirming practices, check out what Chris and I just created, which is called the Neurodiversity Affirming Therapy Academy. It was designed for SLPs, but we've had a lot of other professionals sneak in there. So we won't kick you out if you want to just come in and so that you can learn alongside with us. But we did decide to extend our founding member pricing. So it was set to be $197 a year for all of our trainings. And we decided to extend the $97 for the full year. And that's really because of our goal, and our mission is to spread neurodiversity affirming practices around the world. I mean, we say that every week on this show, and we want to make sure that these trainings are affordable and accessible to anyone, no matter where you are, which is why we decided to do this. So we'll put a link below in case you want to learn more about the Academy. We have tons and tons of trainings in there. So if you are trying to figure out how to support your kids in ND affirming ways, we've got you.
And I wanted to add that it's an ongoing collection. So we're going to continue adding some things. We're always open for suggestions and topics to say, hey, this is a topic that has been in high need of request, and we're here to help support, answer questions, and build on it. So I promise you'll love it. High energy, tons of handouts and all sorts of great stuff. So absolutely.
And we have a monthly live call with our autistic mentor, Chloe Estelle, in there. So you not only get to get all of these amazing trainings, you also get to get time where you get to ask your questions live to our autistic coach, and she is incredible. So really good stuff happening there. Really awesome community being built. We're really excited. So thank you guys for joining us on the show. Like we said, we know we could talk about this a lot longer. So if you want to hear more episodes on this in the future, let us know. But thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Enjoy your evening.
Happy back to school. Thank you so much for tuning in to Making the Shift. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to us if you could like, subscribe, share it with a friend. Our only goal is to spread neurodiversity affirming approaches all over the world, and we can only do that with your help. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.